Disclaimer: this book may contain content that is considered historically inaccurate or culturally insensitive by modern standards. My hope is that by exploring old literature, we will better understand why people of the past thought the way that they did and understand the influences that shape their culture. This video is not intended for young audiences. Content warning for the Kingdom of Kansas. This story includes references to slavery as well as words that some people might find to be hurtful. Listen at your own risk. Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I'm excited to read you from Paul Bunyan by James Stephens. The Kingdom of Kansas. No region of real America, save Kansas, boasted of its weather in Paul Bunyan's time. In the heyday of the mighty logger, the climates and seasons were not systematized. They came and went and behaved without rule or reason. There were many years with 2 winters, and sometimes all 4 seasons would come and go in 1 month. The wind would frequently blow straight up and then straight down. Sometimes it would simply stand still and blow in one place. In its most prankish moods, it would blow all ways at once. The weather was indeed powerful strange in those days, and it got itself talked about. And nowhere were its ways more evil than in Utah. When Paul Bunyan moved his camp to the state of Utah for the purpose of logging off its forests of stonewood trees, he was not careless of the climate. He merely failed to suspect its treachery. Besides, other troubles beset him. The gritty texture of the stonewood timber dulled the edge of an axe bit in 2 strokes. At the end of their 12-hour day in the woods, the loggers had to sharpen axes for 7 hours. They were always fagged out. Then there was only one small river near the forests, and Babe, the blue ox, who had got hay fever again since coming west, drank it dry every 15 minutes. The loggers thirsted, and they were bedeviled by sand in their blankets and in the beans. For every time Babe sneezed, he raised a dust storm that rolled its clouds through the cookhouse and the bunkhouses and covered the great plain and the hills around the camp. A spirit of dark and evil melancholy settled on the loggers. Paul Bunyan hoped for an adequate water supply from the December snows, and he brought all his inventive powers to the problem of felling the stonewood trees. In 11 days and nights he devised 805 systems, machines, and implements, and from this galaxy he selected a noble tool. Paul Bunyan's new invention was the double-bitted axe, which is used everywhere in the woods today. Paul Bunyan devised it so that a father could chop with one blade, then twist the handle and wet the other blade on the gritty stonewood with the backward swing. But even with the new axes, the logging went on slowly. The camp's supply of elbow grease gave out, and the loggers suffered stiffened joints. The December snows were light, and the thirsty blue ox continued to drink the entire water supply. The bunkhouses came to be dens of ominous brooding and quiet instead of gay and noisy habitations. Finally, the shipment of web-footed turkeys from the Great Lakes arrived too late for Christmas dinner. The loggers became dour, gaunt, embittered men. Then came New Year's Day, an outrageous fortune. When the loggers went to work at the first thinning of darkness, they attributed the peculiar, oppressive warmth of the morning to an unusual Chinook wind. There was, however, no wind at all. Then the rising sun shot blazing rays into a cloudless sky. Even then the loggers did not realize that they were witnessing an event. This was the beginning of a notable year, the year of the hot winter. As the sun climbed higher, the heat grew more intense. The Christmas snow had vanished at the first burning touch of day. The ground baked and cracked. The stonewood trees glittered in a fierce light. Each logger threw off his mackinaw, muffler, sweater, stagged shirt, woolen overshirt and undershirt, his paraffin pants, mackinaw pants, and overalls, and his Arctic socks, heavy wool socks, light wool socks, and cotton socks. All heavy clothing was speedily thrown aside, and everywhere in the plain, in the valleys, and on the hillsides were piles of garments, and by each pile a logger toiled, clad only in drawers and cocked boots. But still sweat dripped and trickled from their bodies. They labored more and more languorously. Each quarter of an hour the blue ox, with a lolling tongue, dashed madly from the river and drank it dry. Paul Bunyan was distressed by this change in his affairs, but he was not daunted. Confident that his loggers would do their best in the meanwhile, he again retired to solitude, hoping to devise something that would conquer the hostile and unnatural season. He returned with a great timber scythe, with which he could fell a full section of timber with one swing of his mighty arms. Carrying the timber scythe over his shoulder, Paul Bunyan strode toward his camp. His tread was vigorous, despite the deadening heat. Benevolent ideas stirred his heart. He himself would do the arduous labor of felling the stonewood trees. The loggers would be asked only to do the lighter work of trimming and bucking the trees into logs. They were a fine bunch of savages. Ordinarily, they would not allow even Paul Bunyan to do their natural work. Perhaps they would resist such intrusion now, but the great logger was sure of his persuasive powers. As he neared the camp, busy as he was with philanthropic thoughts, he failed to note an unusual silence in the woods and about the bunkhouses. Not until he saw Babe and the big Swede sleeping in the stable was he made aware of the extraordinary. Paul Bunyan went next to the camp office. Johnny Inkslinger, that tower of energy, was sleeping at his desk. His fountain pen had dropped from his hand, and as it was fed by hose lines from 25 barrels of ink, a black stream gushed from its point and flooded the floor. A chorus of faint snores came from each bunkhouse. The cookhouse looked gloomy and deserted, and the woods, the axes and saws lay where the loggers had left them. For 179 minutes, Paul Bunyan stood silently in the midst of his camp, tormented by wrath, regret, and sorrow. His outfit had failed him. After all these years of comradeship and labor, they had allowed a mere hot winter to provoke them into faithlessness. He had left them without an idea that they would be untrue to the job while he was scheming to make it a success. But they had weakened. Very well, he thought. After his brief period of emotion, he would perform their labor for them while they snored. They should awaken to shame. One stride brought him into the first clearing made among the stonewood trees. Without losing a second, he threw the timber scythe from his shoulder. He grasped its handles, then took a long swing, and the first section of trees thundered to the ground. On he went, making a circular swath. As he stepped with his right foot, the sharp scythe blade crashed through the trees on the cutting stroke, and as he stepped with his left, he brought the scythe behind him with a vigorous swing. On and on he labored, his steps coming faster as the circle widened. Every 7 hours he paused to wet the blade of the timber scythe on a bundle of the stonewood trees which he carried in his hip pocket. The hot winter drove its fires upon him, but his passion of toil repelled them with a stronger flame. The great logger's walk became a run. The dazzling blade of the timber scythe flashed in strokes of inconceivable rapidity. The sections of stonewood trees fell in a steady roar. Then Paul Bunyan began to sweat. He had labored before this, but never so savagely, nor in such penetrating heat. Only the man who raises a good sweat for the first time can realize what an astounding store of perspiration the human body can hold. On occasion, it gushes from innumerable springs, seeming inexhaustible. It streams down the crevices and valleys of the body and floods the flat spaces. It soaks the clothing and drips to the ground. Imagine then what happened when Paul Bunyan's stored perspiration was unloosed. As he toiled on, ever more fiercely, his sweat flooded his boots. It surged over their tops and foamed towards the ground like two Niagaras. His swinging body and flying arms flung out clouds of spray. These strange waters coursed over the plains in torrents and gathered in heaving pools. The little river was submerged, drowned, exterminated. The waters crept toward the camp. Paul Bunyan, more and more engrossed with his labor as time went on, did not note the rising flood. His circle grew wider and wider. It left the plain and swung around the bordering slopes. Section after section of the trees was felled, only to be covered by water, for the stonewood timber was too heavy to float. But Paul Bunyan labored around and around the circles, quite unaware of the tragical consequence of his efforts. For 5 days and nights the loggers lay in their bunks, too lazy to get up to eat, too lazy to do aught but drowse and dream. But at 12 o'clock on the 5th night, the waters had reached had reached the bunkhouses, and they learned of their peril. Yells of fear arose from every quarter, and in a few moments the whole camp, with the exception of Babe, the big Swede, and Johnny Inkslinger, was aroused. Fright made the loggers forget the hot winter and gave them energy. When they looked out on a vast lake glittering in the moonlight and saw in the dim distance the twin rivers roaring from Paul Bunyan's boots, they knew that speedy and efficient action was necessary to save their lives. The best swimmers swam out to the tool house and brought back hammers, saws, and nails. Each logger then began to build a boat from his bunk, and for 3 hours they worked feverishly and silently constructing the vessels. When the last one was finished, the word was passed along, and in a few moments the boats, each one carrying a logger and his blankets, swarmed from the bunkhouses. Before the armada had gone 20 feet, the boats all filled with water and sank, while the loggers uttered lamentable cries. These changed to sounds of rejoicing, however, when it was discovered that the water was only waist deep. The loggers rescued their bundles from the boats and scampered to the shore like a holiday host at a beach. But their joy did not last. It quickly gave way to dread. Paul Bunyan, toiling more desperately every moment, was rapidly moving around the circle. In a short time he would be upon them, and at any instant he might discover the fate of his trees, the flooding of his camp, his complete disaster. The loggers all understood the reason for the mighty man's wrathful labor. Their sense of blame confused them and smothered their native courage. The host began to move over the hills, haltingly at first, and with heads bowed like penitents. Then, as the volleying thunder of Paul Bunyan's timber scythe sounded nearer and nearer, they lifted their heads and struck a faster pace. Then, guilty fears possessed them, and every logger of the lot began to gallop madly. Someone yelled, "Oh, Paul's a-comin'!" and the warning cry was echoed from thousands of throats all over the hills. The loggers were taken by panic. The runaway became a stampede. By dawn, they were making such running leaps that each logger would hit his chin with his front knee and his head with his back heel at every stride. They were so scared that they never stopped until they got to Kansas. Now, Kansas at that time had the only kingdom that was ever known to exist in this country. The ruler of Kansas was King Bourbon, and Topeka was his capital. The Kansas country was then one of the pleasantest in real America. It was rolling land, like that everywhere else, but its heavy vegetation and its forests were beautiful and unique, and the climate and seasons were always spring. And indeed, the history of Paul Bunyan's time tells of a year in Kansas that had 13 months of spring. The forests were mostly whiskey trees, which grew amid carpets of cigarette grass and were entwined with beer vines. The greatest of these forests was around Lake Topeka, and by the lake was the capital city, where the nobility and gentry of Kansas led a pleasurable life and envied no one. When Paul Bunyan's loggers reached Kansas, they were so exhausted from their long run that they had no eyes for the beauties of that region. They only felt that it invited them to rest and promised them security. So when they came to the banks of Rolling River, they dropped on the soft and fragrant masses of cigarette grass and rested in the cool shade of the spreading whiskey trees, with the bliss known only to the utterly wary. For a long while they were not aware of the virile odors of the beer vine blossoms, and they heard but faintly the melodies of the huge but gentle piano birds who were everywhere in the forest, either flitting from bough to bough or sitting in their nests. And even when they were rested and soothed by the sweet airs and tinkling melodies, the loggers enjoyed the originality of their environment but a short while, for each one became conscious of a raging hunger. "Let's look for a nose-bag!" the cry up and down the columns and lines. The loggers all arose with the intent of foraging in the forest, and they would no doubt have appeased their hunger at once, if an impulsive curiosity had not made them take a last look at the river. A great gasp of astonishment went up, then a terrific clash of laughter shook the vast forest and silenced the piano birds. The loggers, one and all, dropped again to the ground and rolled and bounced about in convulsions of merriment. Rolling River was a stubborn and valiant stream, and, unlike tame rivers, it refused to follow the easiest course. For From its source extended a range of hills which decreased in height until it was merged in the slope of a far valley. Rolling River made its way up and down these hills, cleaving each summit. At the place where the loggers were resting, the river always had a hard fight, as one hill was nearly equal in height to the one that preceded it. Sometimes Rolling River would fail here. The waters would part at the summit, and one end of the river would go rushing on, and the other end would slide back down the hill for a fresh start. It was then that the giddy fish which dwelt in this stream would perform so clownishly as to tickle any observer into fits, bewildered by the waters' abrupt desertion of them, and perplexed as to which end of the river it was best to follow. Numbers of them would hesitate on the hilltop, agitated and floundering. Then half of them would take out after the lower end of the river, and half of them would take out after the upper end. They could make great speed by leaping along like kangaroos, using their long fins and tails, but they traveled clumsily, and their limber tongues lolled from their mouths as they leaped down the hillside, all of which made their every action seem inexpressibly humorous. There was never an army of men who enjoyed a good laugh more than Paul Bunyan's loggers, and when they saw the giddy fish galloping after the river, they laughed till they cried. When the river finally made it up the hill and began to roll on as usual, the loggers could hardly stop laughing even then. But they remembered their hunger, and they again got up to search for food. But no sooner had they started than the river parted again, and once more the loggers rolled and laughed over the performance of the giddy fish. And indeed, for 57 hours the loggers were unable to get away from the riverside, for no sooner would they start to leave than the stubborn river and the clownish giddy fish would repeat their hilarious performance. The loggers would no doubt have laughed themselves to death, or else starved, had not King Bourbon come along with his racehorses and jockeys and saved them. King Bourbon had his jockeys make a wall of horseflesh between the laughing loggers and the river, and they were then able to stagger back into the safety of the forest. The king then made the loggers a speech of apology and warning. He told them that the only crimes punishable by death in Kansas were dealing from the bottom of the deck, throwing a horse race or a fight, and shooting craps with loaded dice. Those convicted of such crimes were sentenced to watch the giddy fish until they laughed themselves to death. The king then asked the loggers at what games and contests did they excel, and when they told him of their expertness at spinning logs in rough water, his face shone with a joy that made it brighter than the diamond in his necktie, for this new sport promised to be a thrilling one. He ordered his lord bookmaker to bring them on to the capital and find a place for them in the life of the city. After giving this order, he courteously lifted his plug hat to the loggers and, followed by his jockeys, he set out for Topeka, which was over the next hump. After 3 days, the loggers were themselves again, and they began to explore the delights of the city. Topeka, under King Bourbon's rule, was a city of amusements. There were 11 racetracks, and on each one there were 7 races every afternoon. Each morning there were 5 baseball games, the first one being at 4 a.m. Boxing and wrestling matches, swimming and running races, driving and jumping contests were to be seen each Sunday in the stadium which faced Lake Topeka. In the time between races and contests, the people played poker, solo, rummy, and pool, and shot craps in the palace, which was the one public building in the city. In its single vast room, there were countless tables for the players, and these tables were circled by a bar of such circumference that a man would grow a beard while walking the length of it. The glitter of the glasses and mirrors back of the bar was so brilliant, and the jackets of the bartenders were so white that a beholder seemed to look on ice and snow, which dazzlingly reflected sunlight. But the eye was soothed indeed when its gaze dropped to the dusky mahogany bar and searched the amber depths of a huge glass which frothed with a sharp and fragrant liquid brewed from foamy beer vine blossoms. Even more was the eye delighted when it caught the jolly winks that bubbled from the most potent and jovial beverage, the aged sap of the whiskey tree. One part of the bar was a great free lunch counter, which was always loaded with filling and peppery food. Here the nobility and gentry of Topeka ate and drank, King Bourbon, his lord bookmaker, and his lord bartender among all the rest. The cooks, waiters, and dishwashers had been working 3 shifts on the free lunch counter, but King Bourbon But King Bourbon generously offered Paul Bunyan's kitchen crew employment there, and the Lord Bartender then had to divide the day into 48 shifts in order to have work for everyone. The loggers were royally received into the grand life of Topeka. The skill they displayed in spinning logs on the lake each Sunday won them an honored place in the kingdom. They became tireless players of poker, solo, rummy, craps, and even of pool. They drank huge quantities of beer vine brew and whiskey tree sap. The free lunch made them forget the delights of Paul Bunyan's dinners. Soon they ceased to consider themselves as working loggers, and they repelled with scorn proposals to try a new life of toil, which were slyly made by followers of Duke Dryface, who was a cousin of the king. The Duke was secretly planning a revolt. He had renounced Topeka life, and he now lived among the serfs who brewed the beer vine blossoms, aged the sap of the whiskey trees, and made all of the materials that composed the grand life of Topeka. The serfs were called cornmen, after a harsh cereal which they had devised, and which they all raised in clearings among the whiskey tree forests. Duke Dryface planned to drive the kingdom and his nobility and gentry from the country and clear off the forests, level the hills, and make the whole state into a flat corn country. The king thought him simply a harmless old crank and would listen to no warnings against him. But, nevertheless, the Duke had a revolt well planned for the coming 4th of July celebration. After bribing the bartenders, he had substituted raw sap for the mild and gentle aged liquors to be served on that day. He had the cornmen all grandly inspired and perfectly drilled, instructed, and armed, though he had not converted the loggers. He had directed the bartenders to fill their glasses with triple distilled, high-powered red-eye sap on the night of the 4th, and he was sure that he could capture them and keep them in bondage until the last whiskey tree was felled. The Duke did not fear Paul Bunyan, for he thought the loggers' stories about him to be drunken exaggerations. He thought of him as some plain leader whom they had basely deserted, and who would no doubt be happy to see them punished by slavery. He kept the strength and extensiveness of his power well hidden, and the loggers lived on blissfully in ignorance of their real danger. For many days and nights after the stampede of his loggers, Paul Bunyan had toiled on, swinging his timber scythe with undiminished rapidity. He had not observed the desertion of his men, or the flooding of his camp, or the fate of the stonewood trees. But at last his energy and strength began to fail. His pace slackened. He swung the scythe with slower strokes, and the intervals between the rolling thunders of falling trees became longer and longer. Then the timber scythe dropped from his hands, and he sank to the ground. Now he saw for the first time the shimmering distances of salt water which covered the stonewood trees, and all but the tallest buildings of his camp. For 7 hours he gazed on the lamentable scene. Then his head dropped to the ground. He was not disheartened. He was only tired. He slept. Days and nights went by with little change in the natural season. The days of springtime came, but here there was no spring. Summer days began. The sultriness of the nights got increasingly heavy and thick, and in the daytime the overpowering blaze of the sun seemed to make the very hill shrink, while the surface of the lake was veiled in steaming mists. The slumbers of Paul Bunyan, Johnny Inkslinger, the Big Swede, and the Blue Ox became so deep that the active careers of all of them might have ended there and gloriously had it not been for Babe's appetite, which always tormented him, sleeping or waking. The Big Swede was couched on the high-piled hay in the manger, and Babe's chin rested on his body. Stirred by a hunger that would not be denied, his jaws began to work mechanically. They closed over the 50-pound plug of chewing tobacco that the Big Swede always carried in his hip pocket, and it was swallowed like a blade of grass. Babe gasped, groaned, and shuddered. Then he lunged to his feet, snorting and bellowing, for chewing tobacco was as poisonous to him as to a circus elephant. He gouged the Big Swede viciously with his horns until he awoke with yells of agony and astonishment, and not until he saw, through the stable door, Paul Bunyan asleep on the far side of the lake did Babe heed the foreman's powerful remonstrances. With a last angry toss of his horns, which threw the Big Swede through the stable window, Babe turned and plunged into the water. So fast did he run that he threw foaming waves to the furthest reaches of the lake. When he reached Paul Bunyan, he emitted a joyous bellow and eagerly began licking the great logger's neck. For 1 hour and 27 minutes, Babe assiduously tickled him, and then Paul Bunyan sprang to his feet with a great roar of laughter. He felt strong and fresh. He smiled cheerfully at the blue ox who capered around him. He straddled Babe and rode him across the lake to the flooded camp. There he awakened Johnny Inkslinger, and, refusing to listen to his apologies, he sent him out to discover the trail taken by the loggers. By the time it was found, Paul Bunyan and the big Swede had the camp out of the water and ready to move. Babe was hitched to the buildings, and the search for the errant loggers began. As he traveled on, Paul Bunyan said nothing. His head was bowed in painful meditation. There was still wrath in his heart for his loggers' desertion of him, but there was more of loneliness. Accepting the pleasures of history-making, invention, and oratory, there had never been any joy for him like the joy that comes from the comradeship of labor, and he wished to feel it again. Then he feared that the loggers might be completely lost. They were as helpless as sheep, without understanding guidance. One moment he swore to punish them severely, then his heart would be softened by sad and gentle thoughts. So engrossed was he with perplexing ideas and troubling emotions that he did not notice the decline of heat and the new sweetness in the air as the balmy clime of Kansas was approached. A 4th of July in Topeka during the reign of King Bourbon. Who would not give his fame and fortune to have participated in one of those marvelous celebrations? What pale and weakly imitations we have nowadays of the ball games between the fats and the leans, of the potato races, and of all the other ingeniously devised contests which made the last day of King Bourbon's reign a long procession of glories and wonders. When will we see again parades, marches, and drills performed by uniformed organizations, as they were performed by the bartenders' and bookmakers' bands, the Knights of the Spotted Cubes, the Mystics and Oracles of Fistiana, the Stentorian Order of Umpires, the Grandois Guild of Jockeys, the Loyal Legion of Log Burlers, and many others on that historical day in Topeka? The last named society was a new organization that was composed of Paul Bunyan's loggers. They aroused the wildest enthusiasm when they appeared in the line of march, treading beer kegs, and for this, and for their triumphs in the races, King Bourbon awarded them the grand prize. The bar had been closed for the celebration, and when it was opened in the evening, no one in the spruce and jocund throngs which streamed through its doors suspected that treason was afoot. Clinking of glasses, guffaws, jigging feet, backslapping, bellowed songs, and shouted jests made a tumult of rollicking and boisterous noise as the reveling began. Urged on by the traitorous bartenders, the nobility and gentry drank nothing but the sap of the whiskey trees. It was a mild, mellow, and soothing beverage when properly aged, but the raw green sap which the conspirators had supplied would suddenly addle the mind and paralyze the nerves. The loggers, flushed with conceit over their day's triumph, boasted that they were champion drinkers also, and they dared everyone to enter drinking contests with them. The bartenders, obeying instructions, filled the loggers' glasses with triple distilled, high-powered red-eye. So they were the first to get bleary-eyed, to wilt, and to stagger about. By the time the nobility and gentry had begun to be affected, the loggers had all stumbled outside, or had been carried out. Too late the king and his followers realized that they were the victims of a conspiracy. When the fumes of the powerful green sap had completely befuddled them, the spies of the cornmen lighted the signal fires that were to start the attack. In a short time, the hosts of cornmen, with husking hooks strapped to their left wrists, and with corn knives swinging from their right hands, charged, whooping and bounding, into the city. King Bourbon and his followers, deaf, weak-kneed, colorblind, dumb and addled, could make no resistance. They were driven through the streets, out of the city, on through the whiskey tree forests, and headed towards the far lands of Kentucky. Duke Dryface remained behind with the greater part of the cornmen to secure the loggers, who were laid out in heaps, rows, circles, squares, and fantastic groups all over the city. In 3 hours, half of the loggers had balls and chains locked to their legs. Duke Dryface had begun to breathe easily and to enjoy the first glow of complete triumph when he became conscious of a vast shadow An overpowering presence. The light of the moon seemed blotted out. The ground shook under a monstrous tread. Then sounded a bellow of rage that lifted every cordman and every logger 7 feet into the air and whirled them all over 5 times before they struck the ground again. The rudely awakened and sobered loggers and the frightened cordmen then saw the august figure of Paul Bunyan and the blue ox looming above them. The good and mighty man was chiding Babe for bellowing so loudly and was restraining him from attacking the Duke and his followers. Duke Dryface had the courage of true virtue. He fearlessly stepped up to Paul Bunyan and began a speech. First, he spoke of the sins of King Bourbon and of the oppression suffered by the cornmen. He showed the necessity for reform. Next, he went on to prove that sin was in the very soil of Kansas, and that this soil could only be purified by destroying the evil forests and raising virtuous corn in their stead. That was his main reason for wanting to make slaves of the loggers, he said, but he hoped also to make righteous men of them later. Paul Bunyan nodded gravely for him to go on, and the Duke then rose to the grandest heights of eloquence in describing the moral imperfections of the loggers, deserters, breakarts, beer bibbers, gluttons, cigarette fiends, and many other evil names he called them. Paul Bunyan listened, and the loggers got sick with shame and fear. They had surely sinned. They were indeed lost souls. They felt they would forever despise themselves. Then, just when they had reached the lowest depths of self-loathing and despair, they saw Paul Bunyan give an enormous wink. Only a wink, but what forgiveness flashed from it, what unshakable faith seemed fixed in its depths. That one gesture of an eyelid's restored and consoled them, for it spoke pardon and promised to forget. The Duke declaimed until dawn, but the loggers listened complacently, grinning knowingly at each other. Once more they would toil grandly in the woods. Once more hotcakes, ham, and eggs would sizzle for them on the long kitchen ranges. Once more they would be delighted by the wonders of noble Sunday dinners, for by the wink of his eye Paul Bunyan had made them his loggers again. Paul Bunyan contracted for the logging off of the whiskey trees, and this was easily accomplished by the inspired toil of the loggers. The country was flattened by hitching Babe to each section of logged off land and then turning it over. As Duke Dryface had surmised, the land, though rolling on top, was flat underneath, so that one-time sinful soil of Kansas now lies deeply buried, and only the barest vestiges of the grand life devised by King Bourbon survive anywhere in the Kansas country. And that is the end of The Kingdom of Kansas by James Stephens. Thank you for listening to the story from Paul Bunyan with me, and I hope you return soon for the next one. Have a great day!